so it's great to see so many Python enthusiasts. It's like having PyCon every month. Okay, so I'm going to talk about my favorite web framework, Pyramid. Okay, and we're going to spend, it's a 45-minute talk. We'll spend the first 15 minutes on basics, another 15 minutes on slightly more advanced stuff, and then the last 15 minutes on things like WebSockets and more. And furthermore, you can access this presentation. Just look on the Meetup website. I put a comment, and you can go through the slides at your own pace and the code right now. Okay, so can everybody see that piece of code here? Okay, so you can get started. Installing Pyramid is easy. So start your virtual environment, pip install Pyramid. Okay, so we'll create our first, so we do Pyramid, they have existing scaffolds. So we have a starter scaffold here. Let me show you right now. So let's create a scaffold. Okay. So we just created our scaffold. Here are the files inside it. The next step we need to do is install. And then when we run our server, so this is what you get for free. And on the right, you see the Pyramid debug toolbar that gives you various debug information about your application. Okay, so if you followed along, we just wrote our first Pyramid application. So I want everybody to do this. Okay, and do this. Yeah. Okay, so the most important file in the Pyramid stack is this file called init. It's in the main configuration. And what this init file does in the package is where you specify, is where you configure your WSGI app. So everything that we'll do from now on will take this config file and run functions off of it, and it'll return an app. Okay, so that's our basics. You can read more. You should check the Pyramid documentation and the Pyramid cookbook. There's a lot of examples and I especially recommend the Pyramid cookbook if you're an advanced user. Okay, so views. So the first important concept I told you was the configurator. That's where you configure your WSGI app. The second most important Pyramid concept is your view. So how the internet works in two phrases. Your browser sends requests a URL, and your server my server sends a response. In Pyramid, the route maps the URL to a view, and the view transforms that request into a response. So in our example app, we can see what routes have been defined in, so you see a lot of stuff cruft because that includes the debug toolbar. But here are the routes defined in the production environment. And if you wanted to see which views are defined for the home directory, you can see that the view is called view. So how many people in the audience already knew this stuff? Okay, so most of you are new to Pyramid. Okay, so how to add a view. So adding a view, so if you remember, just as I said before here, the purpose of a view is it transforms a request for a URL into a response. And in Pyramid, we take, if you want to add a view, first you define your view. So we're defining a view called index. It takes a request and returns a response that's rendered into JSON. Okay, and then you specify things with the view config decorator. Okay, and then once you've defined your function, your view, you need to define a route that maps the URL. In this case, we're mapping the home directory into the route name called index. So here's the route name, index. And view config is what connects the view to the route. And here is where we connect the route to the URL. Okay, so this is, so we just went over how to define a view, and this is how, for the most part, you'll be defining the behavior for your web app. Okay, so we just saw a possible renderer code for JSON. Let's say you wanted to use, okay, so the default template renderer is Chameleon. You can see if you edit your, okay, so let's just backtrack a bit. In the default scaffold, you see that they use the Chameleon template with the extension PT. If you wanted to use Mako, Mike Veyer's templating system, there are two steps. First, you need to define in your configuration file where your templates are located. And then you write your template. And finally, you change your renderer to say that you want to use the Mako index. Okay, so we just covered, oh, and one more thing that you'd want to do is, so sometimes it's useful to have global variables in your templates, like user ID or is admin, is member. And you can specify global variables called renderer globals. And here you need to tell your configuration, your configurator to run this function called add renderer globals before it renders each template. So in this case, we're adding a global variable that's accessible in each of our templates as user underscore ID. And here's how you can do it. Okay, so we just covered the basics. If you want to, so the scaffold that we had used earlier was called starter. You can see, oops. Okay, so we just used the starter template. If you want to use Alchemy, if you want to use the default database thing, you can create the Alchemy, so using the Alchemy scaffold. Okay, so now that we've covered the basics, let's take this quick break. So I'm going to ask everybody a question, and in response, I want people to say rated R. Okay. So what's Pirates of which kind of movies? Rated R. Yeah. Okay. So just let's go through that right now. So pcreate, scaffold, Alchemy, R. Okay. Oops, and let me move it back. Okay, so so before we use the starter scaffold, now we're going to use the Alchemy scaffold, which includes support for SQLAlchemy, SQL Alchemy. So that's another question I have to you guys. How many people say SQL Alchemy and how many people say SQL Alchemy? Okay, SQL Alchemy, just so I don't annoy the hell out of you. Okay. Okay, so models. Yeah, so mostly that's what you need to know. Oh yeah, so by default, it includes a transaction manager. And you don't have to do anything. That means that if your view fails for some exception, then it doesn't commit at the end. It'll roll back any database transactions that you had in it. If you write an outside script, which I'll show you soon, you will have to use the transaction manager explicitly. Oh yeah, so an example, so the scaffold includes an example of a script, which I'll talk about soon. So scripts, so you want scripts to also be able to access your database, because in case you have a cron job that modifies your app. But I'll talk about that in the next slide. So scripts. So far you've already seen scripts such as pcreate, proutes, pshell. I don't think I've shown you pshell, but if you want to write your own script, there are two steps. So you have to, first you write your script. The major components, convenience functions here are get app settings, which will take as an argument the path of your application configuration file. So the application configuration file is, for example, development.ini or production.ini. It's a text file that, standard text file that contains your configuration things. And the other thing that you want to do is initialize your database. Okay, so let's say you've written your script. The next thing you have to do is register it. So you edit the setup.py function, and you'll see at the end it says console scripts. Console scripts. You add your script as another line there, and then once you've done that, you can run your script, and it'll on the application configuration file, and it should be able to pick it up. Okay. So one tip that I have, many times you don't want multiple copies of a certain script running at the same time. So you can bind a socket to make sure, because that will fail. Yes?
What is a script? In what context would I
So let's say, okay, let's say you have an application that it's a revenue sharing system, and about once a month you pay out everybody, you share the revenue. In that case, we would have the web app running, and then we might have a cron job that says once a month, pay out these people. So in that case, it would have to access the same database and other things, so that's what I mean by a script. Okay, so, and also in that case, you wouldn't want the payout sent twice, and so that's why it'd be good to bind a socket, and that ensures that only one version of the script is running at one time. Okay, so some tips for debugging. Okay, so a lot of you have probably heard of PDB. You've heard of IPDB, which is PDB using IPython. And you can also use IPython.embed to debug your script. So what IPython.embed will do is it'll drop you right in there into the IPython prompt, and you can do a bunch of things. But what you might not have heard of is PUDB. So PUDB is just like the old days of, if you've used something like Turbo Debugger, it'll give you a nice text graphical thing. So I found it very nice. You might not have known about it. Okay, so I'm trying to get back. Okay, so you can try these on your own. Each of these 4 options is a way for debugging your Pyramid application. Okay, permissions. Let's see how we're doing on time. How many minutes do I have left? Okay, so permissions. This one I want to spend a little time on, because the way Pyramid does permissions/authentication could be confusing, but it's not if you just understand these basic concepts. First, I'm going to go over how to authenticate against your own database, and second, I'm going to show you how to authenticate with a third-party provider, thanks to a package called Velrus that Ben Bangert wrote, and he's actually in the audience today. Okay. So permissions in Pyramid. When somebody accesses your application, we'll call that person a user. A user is in a group. Each group has a set of permissions, and a permission gives that user access to selected views. Where you define, so when you implement this, the place where you define, given a user ID, what groups that user is in, is getGroups, which I'll show you soon. You define what permissions a group has in ACLs in a class called the root factory. And finally, you specify what permission is required to access a view in the view config constructor. Okay, so I'm going to show each of these in specific code. Maybe I'll cut and paste this into something a little easier to read. Actually, okay, so what we just said was, when a person accesses your site, that person is a user. So here's a very stripped down version of how you might implement authentication for your site if it's against your own database. Here's the configurator function that we saw before. First, you choose an authentication policy and an authorization policy. In this case, we chose to use auth ticket. Auth ticket, so there are a couple options. You can either use an auth ticket that's like a little string in your cookie that's been hashed with a little thing to detect whether it's been tampered. Or you could choose to store it in your session and store it on your server. So when you use your authentication policy, okay, so when somebody goes to your site, Pyramid calls the callback getGroups. And getGroups gets something called the user ID. In a real environment, you might check the user ID against the database and retrieve the permissions. But here we'll just do if we do a check for if the user ID is the username says Tigger, then we append the group special. So each group is a string, and getGroups returns, given a user ID, getGroups returns a list of strings that indicate what groups that user ID belongs to. So we just covered the first part, how Pyramid identifies what groups the user belongs to. Now, how does Pyramid identify what permissions each group has? Well, you need to define something called a root factory. And here's where you define your access control list. And you can say, oh, well, this particular group, which is the second column, in this last one, you can see it's special. So allow everybody in the special group to have the permission of Yummy Eat. And the final step of this is then you need to define a view somewhere that's could be in your Yummies module. That given a request and define a view config and the route name being something, and you also need to define the permission is equal to the string Yummy Eat. So here are the three components, and you can look at this. The slides are online. You can look at this in more detail. But that's the main concepts for permissions. Yes? Permission takes a tuple. In which case? Here? That I don't know. Does somebody know the answer to that? I'm guessing you might have to add another line, and that's the way I think I've done it before, if you want to give a view 2 permissions. Okay, so we just covered how to authenticate with your own database. If you want to authenticate with a third-party provider, so third-party provider means, like, for example, OpenID. So OpenID is supported by Google, it's supported by Stack Overflow, and I think GitHub and other things, or OAuth. You can use a package called Velruz. Very recent package, it's nice. All you need to do is include Velruz in your configuration. Let me just go to the site. If it is here. So the nice thing about Velruz is it's a pyramid app. It doesn't require your application to be a pyramid app. But if you are writing a pyramid app, you can take advantage of it. Here's what you need to do in your init file, in your package. You include Velruz. You specify what kind of providers you want to let people log into. Then you specify some credentials. You need to define 2 views. One, so what happens is when in your template you give it a URL that the person will go to. So they'll say, oh, log in via Twitter. They'll click it, they'll be redirected to Twitter's login page. You log in, and based on what happens, you get redirected back somewhere. And when you get redirected back to your application, here are the 2 possibilities. Either the authentication was successful, complete, or it failed. So you need to define 2 views, one, what happened if it was complete, and the other when it's failed. And the last thing that you need to do is, of course, redirect to the URL in your application. So 3 basic steps to use Velruz. Like I said, so define 2 views and include the URL in your template. Okay, so now you've come to deploying your application. I'm only going to show you 3 ways to do it. Okay, so let's say you serve with gEvent. Okay, so since Pyramid is a WSGI application, all of these take the same form, which is you get your app, looks like I can't zoom in. You get your app and, here, let's use this one. You get your app and you give it to the server and you ask it to serve forever. So when you use gEvent, yeah, it's the same. So you get your app, it loads it from the configuration file, and you run it. So something, so gEvent you would use, it's a great, so the default server is Waitress. They use Waitress because it's compatible with a lot of platforms like Windows and Mac, but gEvent is very fault tolerant. Let's say you wanted to serve your thing behind SSL and WebSockets. One thing you could do is serve it behind Node.js. So some corporate or government environments have very strict firewalls and only allow 8443, and even within those ports, they block all non-HTTP protocols. So sometimes to get around that and still be able to have your app use WebSockets, you need to encrypt your WebSockets in SSL. So that's why you need something like this. So this is actually some Node.js code using HTTP proxy. And what it'll do is let you use WebSockets through your secure server. Okay, so another quick note, if you're serving your stuff behind HTTPS, it's useful to have 2 backslashes that will resolve your URL to HTTP or HTTPS, whichever you happen to be using at the moment. And you can see more deployment options in the cookbook in detail. My goal here is just to let you know what's possible so that later on you can look into it. So don't worry if a lot of this is breezing by you right now. Oh, so caching. Caching. I think Canadians say caching. So caching. Caching, you can use, so the original, so Dogpile Cache is the new version of Beaker. Dogpile Cache, it still has the same concept. You make a region. In that region, you specify how you want to store the stuff that you're caching. So in this case, we're storing it in memory, but you just swap this out for Memcached or Redis or files, and that'll be your caching backend. Then you have this decorator on each function that you want to cache, region.cacheOnArguments. And when you run this, you'll see that the first value is not cached because it's computed, and the second one is cached. And the third one, since we invalidated the cache for those arguments, it'll run the thing. So this is the Dogpile Cache, written also by Mike Bayer, who wrote SQL Alchemy. Okay, so let me demonstrate this real quick. And before I go into WebSockets, I can take one question. Okay. So WebSockets is a little harder concept. So before we do that, let's just get up and stretch. People should get up and stretch. And this is actually something you should do in your daily workday. About every 10 minutes, you just get up and stretch, and especially put your neck back like this. And that's so you don't develop this crane neck posture. And while you're at it, since you've gone 30 minutes of pyramid, high-tech stuff, I want you to give your neighbor a high five. Okay, cool. Okay, so now I've woken you up because WebSockets, this is a little more of a higher level topic. And I'm going to need all your attention for this one. Okay, so WebSockets, so how many people have heard of WebSockets? Okay, good. WebSockets, you would use it for if you want to make a real-time app, like a dashboard. For example, if a dashboard is, let's say an emergency responder wants to see where all the firefighters are right now, or a chat application, like chatting. So here, it's actually become very easy thanks to a package called gEvent Socket.io. You can take a look at it. Oh, yeah. The G is very important. Okay, and you want so Jeffrey started it, and I forget his name, but A. Bourget continued it. Okay, so what you need to do to integrate, so you have a couple options when you want to put WebSockets in your web app. The way I originally did it was I had a separate Node.js server running, and my Pyramid app would talk to it as a separate thing. But a better way to do it is actually to have it inside your Pyramid web app. Oops. Okay, so here are the steps to use WebSockets in your application. I'm just going to show you how to use Socket.io. There's a second option called Pyramid Sock.js, and it's more or less the same steps. I like Socket.io they both have, the reason you use this instead of WebSockets directly is because you have a fallback in case the browser doesn't support it. Okay, so the first step, use socket IO server. So that one we actually saw before in the thing on servers. Let me just find it. Okay, well anyhow, so before, somewhere there was, here it is. So here's the part about gEvent socket IO. So this is how you, the first step to using WebSockets in your app is to write a script that actually uses gEvent socket IO server. So that's step number one, done. Now you want to define a view containing socket IO manage. Okay, so what that is so here's our views. Okay, so this is reviewing before how to add a view. What you need to do is define a function that takes a request and returns a response. And in this case, it's returning, this is the response. And it's the route name we're going to use is socket IO. The second step for adding a view is we connect that route to our URL. So we do this doing config.addRoute, which connects the route name socket.io to the URL called socket.io, any URL that matches this pattern. Okay, so we just finished step 2, which is we just defined a view that delegates everything that matches this URL and delegates it to the socket.io manage function, which is a convenience function that is in the package. In that convenience function, what it does is it maps channel names / namespace names into classes that define how your behavior, the WebSocket behavior. So we could have another one like news. And this, we'd have to define a news namespace. Okay. And the next step, almost the final step, is you define your namespace. So this is what happens when it receives certain events. So you define that here. And of course, you also need to connect to the WebSockets in your template, and that one I can show you if you want. Yeah, so in those 3 simple steps, we just enabled our application with WebSockets, and you can start doing some real-time stuff. Okay, some other add-ons that I didn't cover yet. So you can, yes?
So your WebSocket support, how good is it in terms of fallbacks for other, if you don't have WebSockets and you have to support older browsers, how good is the fallback mechanism?
Well, that's why I don't use WebSockets directly. I'm using the socket.io package. So there, as far as I know, it's a pretty excellent fallback. So here's this is not Python. This is I guess the protocol, but yeah, it'll fall back to long polling if there's no WebSockets.
It wasn't as good as they advertised.
Oh, really?
Maybe it's improved.
Yeah, it's been a while, but yeah, it seems to work well for me. There's long polling and then there's flash, so they have like 3 or 4, 5, 6 fallbacks. But like I said, I'm warning you, it's still an early stage technology, so you don't want to rely on it too heavily. Okay, so if you want to, other add-ons, there's a bunch of add-ons that we didn't cover, and they all follow the same kind of format. Yes? Oh, yeah. I don't think so, because this is, at this point, we've we've handed it off to this socket IO manage function. So Pyramid, once it reaches this point, Pyramid isn't responsible for it anymore. Because I don't think socket, so once it connects to the socket, it's talking inside it, and it's not through URLs anymore. Other add-ons are pretty much the same. To use them, you have to config include it, and then you do some configuration stuff. So you can send mail, you have sessions, forms, and you still have form encode back from the Pylon days for validating forms. Okay, so some future directions for Pyramid. It'd be nice if we had a unified payment system. So just like we have Velrus for unified authentication, you have a lot of payment stuff right now, like Wallet and Amazon and Square and PayPal. It'd be nice if there was one. So some ways that you can contribute to Pyramid. A lot of ways to keep it alive if you don't want this project to die. You can answer questions. I think O'Reilly's looking for somebody to write a book on it, and pull requests and add-ons. So I think that's it. So now I can take questions.